The lawyer's words echoed in the sterile office as he read Dad's will aloud. 200 acres of prime farmland, 50 head of cattle, and the main house, all going to my older brother Marcus. I sat there, hands folded, watching Marcus try to hide his satisfaction behind a mask of false sympathy. And to Samuel, the lawyer continued, the old red barn and surrounding 2 acres. 2 acres. After 28 years of working this land alongside Dad, feeding cattle at dawn, mending fences until dusk, I inherited a crumbling barn that hadn't housed livestock in a decade. Marcus owned everything that mattered, everything that generated income. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Samuel, honey, you know your father loved you both equally. He just thought Marcus was better suited for running the family business. I finished. The words tasted bitter. Marcus finally spoke. Sam, you know I'll always take care of you. You can work for me, same as before. Nothing has to change. But everything had changed. I wasn't a partner anymore. I was a potential employee on land I'd helped build. The barn Dad left me was a consolation prize, a pat on the head for the son who'd never quite measured up to his older brother's vision of farming. Walking out of that office, I made a decision that would surprise everyone, including myself. I wouldn't work for Marcus. I wouldn't accept charity or pity. That old barn might be falling apart, but it was mine. 2 acres might seem like nothing compared to 200, but it was a start. Sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the strongest trees. The next morning, I loaded my pickup truck with everything I owned, which wasn't much. Clothes, tools, a coffee maker Mom had given me for Christmas, and Dad's old toolbox he'd passed down years ago. Marcus stood on the front porch of what used to be our family home, watching me with arms crossed. This is ridiculous, Sam. You're being stubborn. I secured a tarp over my belongings. Maybe, but it's my choice to make. The old barn sat a quarter mile from the main house, connected by a dirt road that wound through a small grove of oak trees. As I drove toward it, memories flooded back. Dad and I had stored hay here when I was 12. We'd fixed the roof together one summer, him teaching me which shingles could be salvaged and which needed replacing. The barn was worse than I'd remembered. Paint peeled off its sides like sunburned skin. Half the roof had a slight sag, and I could see daylight through gaps in the boards. But the foundation was solid fieldstone, and the frame was good oak timber. Dad had built things to last. I spent that first day cleaning out years of accumulated debris, rusted farm equipment, rotted hay bales, and families of mice who'd made the place home. By evening, I'd cleared enough space to set up a camping cot in one corner. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I listened to the wind whistling through the barn walls. It was cold, lonely, and probably foolish. But for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Tomorrow, I'd start building something of my own. I woke before dawn to the sound of Marcus's tractors starting up across the field. Through the gaps in the barn walls, I watched him begin his morning routine. Our morning routine until now. The familiar pang of loss hit me, but I pushed it down. This was my choice. Over coffee heated on a camp stove, I sketched out ideas in an old notebook. 2 acres wasn't enough for cattle or row crops, but it could support something smaller, more intensive. Specialty farming, maybe organic vegetables for the farmer's market in town, or herbs. Restaurants always needed fresh herbs. The barn itself could be converted. The main floor could house equipment and storage, while the loft could be transformed into a small living space. It wouldn't be luxury, but it would be functional and mine. I drove to town that morning and walked into First National Bank, where I'd had an account since I was 16. Mrs. Henderson, who'd known my family for decades, looked up from her desk with sympathy in her eyes. Samuel, I heard about your father's will. I'm so sorry. Don't be, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I'm here about a small business loan. Her eyebrows rose. Oh? I laid out my plan, converting the barn, starting a specialty crop operation, targeting local restaurants and farmers markets. She listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. "It's ambitious for 2 acres. "It's ambitious for me," I corrected. "But I think it could work." She studied my face for a long moment. "Your father always said you had more ideas per square foot than Marcus had per acre. Let me see what we can do." The loan came through, smaller than I'd hoped, but enough to get started. I spent the first week of March ordering supplies: lumber for framing, insulation, basic electrical supplies, and seeds for my first crops. Everything was delivered to the main house, since the barn didn't have a proper access road yet. Marcus helped me unload, though he grumbled the entire time. "You could have all this and more if you'd just stay on as my partner." "Your employee," I corrected, lifting a bundle of 2x4s. "Partner, we could work something out." I paused, looking at him seriously. "Marcus, I know you mean well, but I need to do this my own way." He shook his head but didn't argue further. The first major project was making the barn weather-tight. I stripped off the old roofing, replaced rotted sections of the frame, and installed new metal roofing that would last decades. Working alone was slower than I was used to, but there was something meditative about the rhythm of hammer on nail, the satisfaction of seeing progress at the end of each day. Evenings were the hardest. After 12 hours of physical labor, I'd sit on my cot eating dinner from a can, listening to the sounds of family life drifting over from the main house. Mom's laughter, the screen door slamming. Normal life continuing without me. But each morning brought new possibilities. I laid out my garden plots, testing the soil, planning drainage. The earth here was good, the same rich loam that made Marcus's fields so productive. I might only have 2 acres, but they were 2 very good acres. By the end of March, the barn was structurally sound and mostly weather-tight. Time to start planting. April brought warm days and the promise of growing season. I'd decided on a mix of herbs and specialty vegetables: basil, oregano, heirloom tomatoes, peppers, and microgreens. High-value crops that didn't require massive acreage but demanded attention and skill. I built raised beds from cedar planks, filling them with a mix of compost, peat, and local soil. Each bed was 4 feet wide and 20 feet long, easy to reach across, efficient to water and maintain. By the time I'd finished, I had 20 beds arranged in neat rows behind the barn. The seedlings came from Henderson's garden center in town. Mrs. Henderson's daughter, Sarah, ran the business now, and she was enthusiastic about my project. "Nobody around here grows really good herbs," she said, helping me load trays of seedlings into my truck. "The restaurants always have to order from the city. You could fill that niche." I'd already visited 3 restaurants in town, showing them my business plan and asking about their needs. 2 had expressed genuine interest, especially in fresh basil and specialty peppers they couldn't source locally. Planting was meditation. Each seedling carefully placed, watered, marked. I worked from sunrise to sunset, taking breaks only when my back demanded it. Marcus drove by occasionally, slowing his tractor to watch me work. Sometimes he'd wave. Sometimes he'd just shake his head and continue on. Mom visited every few days, bringing homemade sandwiches and unsolicited advice. "You're working yourself too hard, Samuel." "It's my work, Mom. That makes all the difference." The seedlings took hold quickly in the rich soil. Within 2 weeks, I could see new growth. Green shoots reaching toward the sun, tiny leaves unfurling, life taking root where I'd planted it. For the first time since Dad died, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. May brought unexpected challenges. A late frost nearly killed my tomato seedlings, forcing me to cover everything with bed sheets and tarps at 2 in the morning. Aphids discovered my pepper plants. The irrigation system I'd cobbled together kept breaking down, leaving me to hand water everything with a garden hose. But the plants that survived grew strong. My basil developed the intense flavor that only comes from stressed, well-tended plants. The heirloom tomatoes, though slower to mature than hybrids, showed the distinctive characteristics that would make them valuable to discerning chefs. I spent mornings in the garden and afternoons continuing work on the barn conversion. I'd framed out a small apartment in the loft, bedroom, kitchenette, and bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but it beat sleeping on a cot surrounded by gardening tools. The physical work was changing me. I'd always been strong from farm labor, but this was different. Every callus, every aching muscle was mine, earned through my own choices and mistakes. When Marcus drove by now, he looked less skeptical and more curious. One evening, he stopped his truck and walked over to where I was installing a drip irrigation line. "Plants look good," he admitted. "Thanks." I wiped sweat from my forehead. "How are your cornfields doing?" "Good. Prices are down, though, always something." He kicked at a clod of dirt. "You really think you can make this work? 2 acres?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'm going to find out." He nodded slowly. "Dad would have liked seeing you try something new. He always said you had good instincts." It was the first time either of us had mentioned Dad without tension since the will reading. Something loosened in my chest. "He taught me everything I know about growing things." "He taught us both," Marcus said. Then he got back in his truck and drove home. June brought my first real harvest. The lettuce and spinach had matured quickly, producing tender leaves that practically glowed with health. My microgreens, pea shoots, sunflower greens, and radish sprouts were ready for cutting just 10 days after planting. I'd arranged to meet with Chef Rodriguez at Farmhouse Table, the best restaurant in our small town. I arrived with carefully packed samples of everything I'd grown, hoping my nervousness didn't show. Chef Rodriguez was a serious man in his 50s who'd moved here from Chicago to escape city life, but couldn't abandon his standards for quality ingredients. He examined each sample carefully, tasting, considering. The basil is exceptional. Very concentrated flavor. He tried the microgreens. "These are restaurant quality. Where did you learn to grow like this?" "Trial and error, mostly. And YouTube," I admitted. He laughed. "The best teachers sometimes come from unexpected places." He leaned back in his chair. "I'll take everything you can provide of the basil and microgreens. The lettuce, too, if you can guarantee consistent quality and weekly delivery." We shook hands on my first commercial sale. Walking back to my truck, I felt 10 feet tall. The farmer's market was my next target. Saturday mornings in the town square, local growers selling directly to consumers who cared about quality and freshness. I set up a small table with hand-lettered signs describing each variety of produce. Sales were slow at first. People knew me as one of the Johnson boys, but they didn't know me as a farmer. By noon, though, word had spread about the quality of my greens. I sold out of microgreens and most of my lettuce. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught me in 3rd grade, bought a bunch of basil. "Your father would be proud, Samuel. This is beautiful work." For the first time in months, I went to sleep that night without worrying about the future. July established routines that would define my new life. Mornings began at dawn in the garden, harvesting what was ready, watering, checking for pests or disease. Afternoons were for processing, packaging, and deliveries. I'd converted part of the barn's ground floor into a packing area with a commercial sink, scales, and a walk-in cooler I'd bought used from a restaurant supply company. Word of mouth was spreading faster than I'd expected. Chef Rodriguez recommended me to 2 other restaurants in neighboring towns. The farmers market customers were becoming regulars, asking specifically for my booth and pre-ordering specialty items. I reinvested every dollar back into the operation. More seeds, better tools, drip irrigation upgrades. I hired 2 high school kids to help with harvesting and packing during peak season, Jake Morrison and Emma Chen, both eager to learn and grateful for summer work. "Mr. Johnson, how did you know exactly when to harvest these?" Emma asked one morning, holding a perfect head of butter lettuce. "Feel the weight," I said, hefting another head. And look at the color. Dad always said plants tell you what they need if you know how to listen. Teaching them gave me unexpected satisfaction. I was passing along not just techniques, but the deeper understanding of growing things that Dad had given me. Marcus stopped by one afternoon while I was loading my truck for deliveries. "Heard you're supplying half the restaurants in the county now." "3 restaurants," I corrected. "But it's growing." He walked through my garden rows, examining the plants with a farmer's practiced eye. "Quality's impressive. You're getting better yields per square foot than I get per acre on some crops." "Different approach, different scale," I said. "Different vision," he acknowledged. "Maybe you were right to try this your own way." It felt like forgiveness, finally flowing both directions. August brought decisions about growth. I had more demand than I could meet with my current setup, but expanding meant taking on debt and risk. The logical next step was adding greenhouse space to extend my growing season and increase production density. I spent evenings researching greenhouse designs, costs, and financing options. A 30-cotton 60-foot structure would nearly double my productive capacity while allowing year-round growing. It would cost more than my remaining loan balance, requiring another trip to Mrs. Henderson's bank. "Your first season results are impressive," she said, reviewing my financial statements. "Revenue exceeded projections by 30%. The demand is there. I just need capacity to meet it." She approved a second loan, smaller than the first, but enough for the greenhouse and associated infrastructure. I felt the familiar mix of excitement and terror that comes with betting everything on your own judgment. Construction began in September. This time, Marcus surprised me by offering help. "I've got some downtime before corn harvest. These old bones could use a project that doesn't involve machinery." Working together felt natural, like we'd never stopped being brothers and partners. He had skills I'd forgotten: precision with measuring and cutting, an intuitive understanding of structural engineering. I had new knowledge about specialized growing systems and climate control. Mom brought lunch one day while we were setting the frame. "It makes my heart happy to see you boys working together again," she said. "Different project, same family," Marcus replied. The greenhouse rose quickly with both of us working. By October, it was enclosed and equipped with benches, irrigation, and a basic heating system. I planted my first winter crop, lettuce and herbs that would grow through the cold months while my outdoor beds rested. Standing inside that greenhouse at sunset, surrounded by neat rows of seedlings, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: complete satisfaction with where I was and what I was building. November brought the first frost and the end of my outdoor growing season. But inside the greenhouse, life continued under controlled conditions. Lettuce, spinach, and herbs thrived in the protected environment while the world outside turned brown and dormant. I used the quieter winter months to plan Year 2 expansion. The demand for locally grown produce was stronger than I'd anticipated, especially from restaurants willing to pay premium prices for consistent quality and reliability. I'd proven the concept worked. Now I needed to scale efficiently. The barn conversion was finally complete. My loft apartment was small but comfortable, with a proper kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom. Living where I worked eliminated commuting time and kept me connected to the daily rhythms of growing things. I could check the greenhouse temperature from my bedroom window, respond immediately to any problems. Christmas Eve. Marcus knocked on my door with a bottle of whiskey and an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking about what you're doing here," he said as we sat in my small living room. "You're on to something bigger than just your 2 acres. "How do you mean?" "This specialty farming, direct marketing approach. There's demand for it, and profit margins are better than commodity crops." He took a sip of whiskey. "What would you think about expanding onto some of my land? Partnership this time. Real partnership." I was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at the chance. Now things were more complicated. "I appreciate the offer, Marcus, but I need to think about it." "Of course. No pressure. Just consider it." After he left, I walked out to the greenhouse to check on my plants. They were thriving under the artificial lights, ignorant of the season outside. I'd built something here from nothing, proved I could succeed on my own terms. The question was whether partnership would enhance that success or compromise it. Some decisions require time to ripen, like fruit on a vine. March brought planning for my second season. I'd saved enough to add 4 more greenhouse bays and upgrade my processing equipment. The winter crops had sold steadily to restaurants, providing cash flow during what would normally be an income-free period. Jake and Emma were eager to return for summer work, both having learned valuable skills the previous year. Emma had started a small garden at home, experimenting with techniques I'd taught her. "I think I want to study agriculture in college," she said one morning while we transplanted seedlings. "Before working here, I never realized farming could be this scientific." "The best farming always has been," I replied. "We just forgot that for a while." I was expanding my crop selection based on restaurant feedback, adding unusual varieties of peppers, Asian greens, and edible flowers that chefs struggled to source elsewhere. Each new variety required research, testing, and careful attention to growing requirements. Marcus had mentioned his partnership offer several times over the winter, but hadn't pressed for an answer. I could see him watching my expansion with interest, calculating possibilities. His corn and soybean operation was profitable but vulnerable to commodity price swings. What I was building had different economics: smaller scale, higher margins, more direct control over pricing. One evening, he helped me move irrigation lines for the new greenhouse sections. "You know, Dad always said diversity was the key to surviving in farming," he said. I thought he meant diverse crops on the same land. Maybe he meant diverse approaches on the same farm. "Maybe," I agreed. "But this works because it's focused. Adding scale might change the fundamental economics, or it might create opportunities neither of us could achieve alone." The conversation stayed with me as I worked through my expansion plans. Success brings its own challenges, including the temptation to grow beyond optimal size. April through August of my second year established patterns that would define the long-term trajectory of my operation. Production increased dramatically with the additional greenhouse space, but so did complexity. Managing crop rotations, harvest timing, and quality control across multiple varieties required systems and attention to detail I was still developing. Restaurant demand had grown beyond my capacity. I was turning away potential customers, always a good problem for a business but frustrating when you're trying to build relationships. The farmers' market booth had evolved into a community gathering place where people came as much for conversation about growing techniques as for produce purchases. Emma had recruited 2 of her friends to help with peak season work, creating a small crew of young people who approached farming with enthusiasm and fresh perspectives. They asked questions I'd never considered, suggesting improvements and innovations I might have missed. "Why don't we grow the specialty mushrooms Chef Martinez keeps asking about?" Jake suggested one morning. "There's that empty corner in Greenhouse 3 that's too shady for most crops." "Mushrooms require completely different growing conditions and expertise," I explained. "So did microgreens last year," Emma pointed out. "You figured those out." They were right, of course. Growth required constantly expanding my knowledge and capabilities. I spent evenings researching mushroom cultivation, eventually setting up a small experimental area to test whether I could produce restaurant-quality shiitakes and oyster mushrooms. By late summer, it was clear that I'd need to make decisions about the future direction of the operation. Current growth was sustainable, but reaching natural limits. Expanding further would require either additional land or different approaches, or partnership with someone who had complementary resources and skills. Marcus's offer was looking more attractive as the complexity of running a larger operation became apparent. But partnership meant sharing control, something I'd fought to achieve. September brought harvest season's intensity and the pressure of major decisions. My second year had exceeded every projection, revenue up 180%, Customer base expanded to include restaurants in 3 counties and a waiting list of potential wholesale buyers. But success was creating problems I hadn't anticipated. Working 14-hour days was sustainable for a season, not indefinitely. Quality control was becoming challenging with increased volume. Most importantly, I was spending less time growing and more time managing, which felt like moving away from why I'd started this venture. Marcus's partnership proposal had evolved over months of conversations. He was offering 20 acres of his best land, his experience with larger-scale operations, and capital for major equipment purchases. In exchange, he wanted partnership in an expanded specialty crop operation that would diversify his farm's income while maintaining the quality standards I'd established. "Think about it," he said one evening while we walked through my greenhouse. "You've proven the market exists and developed the growing expertise. I have the land, equipment, and business management experience. Together, we could build something bigger than either of us could manage alone." The offer was compelling, but it meant giving up the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. I'd started with nothing but a broken-down barn and proved I could build something valuable through my own efforts. Partnering with Marcus felt like returning to the shadow of being the younger Johnson brother. Mom weighed in with characteristic directness during one of her weekly visits. "Samuel, pride is a luxury you can afford when you're young and have unlimited time. You're 30 now. Build something that will last." That night, I sat in my greenhouse among the plants I'd nurtured from seeds, thinking about what I really wanted from this life. The satisfaction of growing things, the financial security of a successful business, the respect that comes from building something significant. Maybe all 3 were possible, but perhaps not all at once. Some decisions can't be rushed, but they also can't be postponed indefinitely. October brought resolution and new beginnings. After weeks of careful consideration and detailed planning, I accepted Marcus's partnership offer, with conditions that protected the essential elements of what I'd built while allowing for growth I couldn't achieve alone. We structured the partnership to maintain quality control standards and growing practices I'd developed while expanding onto 20 of his acres. I would manage the specialty crop operation with full authority over growing decisions, while Marcus would handle business operations, equipment, and logistics. Profits would be split equally after each of us received salaries for our contributions. The barn remained mine, along with my original 2 acres. It would serve as headquarters for the specialty operation and continue housing my experimental plots where I tested new varieties and techniques. The apartment I'd built would remain my home, keeping me connected to the daily rhythms of the farm. Construction began immediately on processing facilities and additional greenhouse space. By spring, we'd have capacity to supply every restaurant within 50 miles while maintaining the farmers' market presence that had become important to our community identity. Emma had decided to attend agricultural college, but would continue working summers and helping train new employees. Jake was taking a gap year to work full-time and learn business operations, with plans to eventually manage day-to-day production while I focused on research and development. Christmas Eve, Marcus and I stood in the original greenhouse, looking at the lettuce and herbs that would provide income through the winter months. "Dad would be proud of what we've built together," he said. "What we're building," I corrected. "This is just the beginning." Looking back, I can see that receiving only the old barn and 2 acres wasn't a disappointment. It was an opportunity. Sometimes the smallest inheritance can grow into the largest legacy when cultivated with dedication, vision, and the willingness to start from zero. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of the world are you listening from? And if you enjoyed this journey from a broken-down barn to a thriving farm business, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, growth, and second chances.